over some questions from, the board first, and then we would get to input from the public. But one thing before that, the board is has the benefit of working with a member from the state who is well-versed in 40B, and his name is Joe Pesnola. He's here with us tonight, and he's going to be helping guide the board along the way through this process, since we don't do these very often, and we want to make sure we get them done right. Joe is going to give us a brief overview of 40Bs and the process and so forth. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Again, my name is Joe Pesnola, and I am here through a grant that the board applied for to Massachusetts Housing Partnership for assistance, for advisory consulting services to help the board through what is a very complicated process. Chapter 40B was enacted in 1969 by the state legislature. It's sometimes called the anti-snob zoning law, and its purpose was to kind of even the playing field with regards to cities and towns providing affordable housing throughout the Commonwealth, and that the cities were taking the burden of or the brunt of providing that housing, and towns were essentially zoning themselves out of multifamily housing. So the state, in its infinite wisdom, put the legislation together, and there is regulation that governs the implementation of a Chapter 40B project. That those regulations are changed from time to time, and the most recent change was in 2008. Essentially, the process is an applicant can propose a Chapter 40B project if it meets three tests. The first, that it has a subsidy, and the subsidy in this case is not financial. It's the support of the state. So the applicant applies to the state for what's known as a project eligibility letter. They've done that. They have, and it's an initial review of the project and its feasibility, and that it meets certain criteria. They've done that. The state, while it's not an approval, the state grants this project eligibility letter. So they've passed that test. The second is that they have control of the site, and they do by virtue of owning the site. The third is that they are or will be what's known as a limited dividend organization. And what that essentially means is they will abide by all of the regulatory requirements for administration of the affordable units, and that they will also limit their profit. In the case of a rental project, their profit is limited to 10% of imputed equity on an annual basis. And I don't need to know the particulars of that, nor do you. It's something that the state controls and the state governs. And the project owner will have to file annually with the state to prove that they're meeting that threshold. But there is, and the idea there, putting that into the regulation, is they didn't want the system to be used to go too far and gain too much profit. So what the state believed was an acceptable profit, the developer has to agree to limit to that threshold. Why? I mean, why a 40B? Why does the state think that the town needs affordable housing? The state has what's known as a subsidized housing inventory, in which it tracks how many units in a certain town are considered affordable, and the definition of affordable units by the state's standard is that it meets a certain criteria for the income level of a resident, but it also has a deed restricted mechanism that when it's sold, or in this case rented to the next renter, that there's a mechanism in place that it is going to a person who qualifies under the income eligibility. So the state understands that creation of affordable housing can't always be done by the federal government or the state or nonprofits with subsidies. So it allows private developers to do so in exchange by allowing them to develop market rate housing as long as at least 25% of the housing is affordable. So it's a balancing test with regards to that. The applicant is entitled to request waivers from all local requirements, and the biggest of which is zoning. So they have to present a list of waivers to the board that outline exactly where they do not meet the requirements. In granting the approval or denial of the project, the board is required to look at applications a little differently than a special permit or a variance. As the board knows, there are very specific requirements for grant of variance in the state statute, and there are guidelines with regards to the grant of special permits. And special permits are granted with a high degree of discretion on the part of the board in looking at impacts and so forth. With regard to a Chapter 40B, the board must start their deliberation under the presumption that the need for affordable housing outweighs the local concerns. And that presumption is powerful for the applicant or for the process. Because the need for affordable housing is defined by each town's requirement to have at least 10% on that subsidized housing inventory, 10% of their total housing stock at or above that benchmark. Drake, it's under that 10%, so therefore there is a defined need. So we have to start from that presumption. So it is a balancing test, and with regards to overcoming the balance or tipping it the other way, the town has to look at at local concerns. And as the chairman outlined at the beginning, the items that you're looking at are health, safety, environment, open space, things of that matter that you look at. And when you look at an item that falls into one of those categories, if there is a problem that can't be mitigated through conditions or changes to the plan, and it's so egregious it starts to outweigh that balancing test, that presumption. And that would be something that would allow the board to consider a denial or an approval with conditions that might mitigate that beyond what the applicant may be willing to offer. With regards to the decision, the board has three options. It can approve it. It can approve it with conditions, which is the most popular approach, or it can deny the application. As far as appeals, the developer can appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee. And the Housing Appeals Committee is not a court. It's a division within the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development. The process that they go through in adjudicating that appeal is very court-like, with a magistrate and a process of witnesses and testimony and the like. But that is the place that the developer goes if they're aggrieved by the decision. One of the tenets of the decision is that it cannot render the project uneconomic. And economic is defined within the regulations. And we can discuss that more in more detail when we go down the road. If a neighbor or an aggrieved party outside of the developer wants to appeal, then the appeal rights mirror Chapter 40A. So it's either to land court or Superior Court through that process. So it's a very brief overview of the process. My job here is to help the board. I'll start by putting a letter together that reviews the application and its compliance with the regulations. And I will assist Allison in taking in and deciphering departmental comments. I will assist in engaging peer review and kind of defining that and helping the board. And then my job is to help the board usher yourselves through the process over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And then be here to help with the decision. All along the way, I'm here, I'll be at each hearing and be able to answer any questions the board members may have with regards to process, and whatever comes up. So.
All right, very good. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you.
And also, I do want to thank Allison Manoogian for her efforts in putting forth the grant requests, able to bring Joe to us. So, thanks. All right. So now we get to the part for board's questions, which we can entertain any questions that we have. I'd like to actually start one question, and that is. One thing, and maybe Joe can comment on this, depends. I noticed that in the filing of the 40B application with Mass Housing, that it was done by Riverbank Properties, LLC. And yet the application that came before the board is actually for a different entity called Greenmont Commons LLC. And I'd like to understand, to me, that almost, in a sense, is potentially a change of ownership. And I know there are rules about ownership changes and so forth.
There's guidance on ownership changes once the comprehensive permit is issued.
Right.
If we're talking about related entities, then at this stage of the process, I don't see it as a fatal flaw or anything to worry the board. As I said, the applicant needs to be a limited dividend organization. There's really no such thing as a limited dividend organization until the entity, whoever the entity is in the end, signs what's known as a regulatory agreement with the state, which binds them to all of that, all of the requirements there, including their limitation on profit. What many times happens is you may have an LLC that, as a developer, that you're taking properties in under, you're buying it under the LLC. But with a 40B, you want to set up a very separate individual LLC that's only going to do this project, because their profits, their books have to be wide open.
Okay. Yeah.
Because they have to do that annual cost certification, that annual where are they with their imputed equity, and where do they fall with the 10%. Everything coming in and out of that entity has to be tracked. So many times, right before they apply, they set up this LLC, and then again, once they sign the regulatory agreement, that becomes the LDO, and then that's the entity that's tracked through the process.
Right.
If at any point after issuance of the comprehensive permit, they sell the project, either before it's built or after it's built. Then there are some guidelines with regards to notification of the town.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so the fact that this change took place, or let's say the original company, Riverbank Properties, there's no, when they go for the eligibility letter, the Mass Housing is not necessarily looking at any sort of financial backing of, or financial makeup of, say, Riverbank. They're just waiting. The fact that it changed over is
They do
immaterial.
some bit of scrutiny on the developer themselves, but
Okay.
it's not directed at a particular LLC. It's at the developer and their history of development
Okay.
and their capabilities and their financial their financial backing to be able to handle the project. So it's more about that. And what I can do in my initial review is I can look at the two LLCs and report to the board that that the managing partner is both in both LLCs is the same person.
Right. Okay, perfect.
I have a
Thanks.
question for you, Joe. You mentioned financials. Are we allowed to look at the project financials or hire a consultant to review the project financials?
Very good question. Since the 2008 regulation changes, no. Not under a particular condition. And that is if the board proposes a condition, a series of conditions, a denial of a waiver or a denial of several waivers or culmination of all of those things. And within the public hearing, the applicant states to the board that action of the board will render the project uneconomic. Don't put that condition on us. At that moment, you open the books, and you can then hire a financial consultant to look at their pro forma and go over and prove that. I've seen it done on for sale projects because it's a fairly easy exercise. In the case of a for sale project, it's 20% of in and out. So you just look at project costs and project revenues, and the profit limitation is 20%. When you get into a rental project, it's forecasting rents, and it's looking at what they define as imputed equity, and it becomes very complicated. And what I've seen on rental projects for the past 5 years is every project comes into a zoning board uneconomic. So almost any condition that would cost the project more is going to render the project uneconomic. So I think because of that, it may be a futile exercise. I would spend the board's energies more on trying to compel the applicant to try to address your concerns through mitigation or changes to the plan.